Very excited about this one. We're going to jump in and get started. So there's going to be a lot that we cover in here, and I want to go step by step and also make sure that we have enough time for questions or feedback, ideas, notes, all that good stuff. And then the last thing is we're going to demo a free guide that I'm going to make sure to follow up and send to everybody. That is really just a quick preview of a bigger playbook that is really meant to build or rebuild your workspace to optimize for making sure that everything has a purpose and has a clear intention, and also to avoid workspaces unraveling, which they tend to do quite a bit just from working with clients pretty often. If we haven't met before, I see some familiar faces here, but my name is Dave DeCespedes. I'm a certified Notion consultant. I've been doing this for almost 3 years now. Have also run a Notion consulting bootcamp course to help aspiring Notion consultants. Objectives for today, primarily, we want to come away with strategies on how to organize, manage, and streamline, keywords there, our Notion workspace. So we're going to get into first, think it through what the aimless or the anti-workspace looks like to see if there's any common threads there. I know there's some of these that I'm guilty of. We're also going to get into the purposeful, which is misspelled, workspace, which is specifically looking at the 3 stages of optimizing our workspace for purpose. Specifically, how are we organizing information? Once it's organized, how do we manage it? And then how can we get into streamlining once we have those first 2 phases completed or done? And then, as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at the playbook preview, which is a guide driven by some custom AI blocks in a Notion page, which you'll get access to, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So for context, just to set the tone of what Notion is, because it could be a lot of things, but primarily based on what the majority of teams use it for, it could be note-taking, task management, database management, a lot of focus on collaboration, but it's really meant to centralize information and streamline work. Not every single action or workflow needs to live in Notion, but it's really optimized to be a digital space to consolidate all of these areas and initiatives and maybe connect to other tools that we're using. So there's a lot that we can do in Notion, which is, I think, why a lot of teams tend to get overwhelmed really quickly or just not know where to start and what step 1 looks. Before we get into building with purpose, it's important to understand what the anti-workspace looks like. So the workspace that, instead of facilitating better, smarter, faster work, it's doing the opposite. It's creating clutter. It's creating confusion, anxiety, overwhelm, just by way of how we're setting up our workspace, or maybe where we're linking certain information, or just maybe having not fully thought through our processes. So when we think of the anti-workspace, some things that come to mind are workflows where there are still way too many manual steps, so that we end up with more work about work rather than the actual work, if that makes sense. Also, workspaces that are optimized for one archetype, especially if we're working in teams. This happens a lot where a workspace is built usually by one person or a small team that are actually one of many different workspace archetypes that tend to approach workspace design in very different ways, which causes friction, because if it's designed in a particular way that doesn't quite vibe with the rest of the team, it just creates frustration and confusion. Information overload, maybe too much information, or information that's not grouped or organized in a way that's intuitive, or just generally a lot of manual actions. This one comes up a lot as well, where workspaces look great, everything is connected, everything is visible, but there's still way too much manual updating and maintaining, which really ends up being a downside and a net negative, because we are adding more work to our plates. And I don't know about you all, but everybody that I work with is wearing many hats and doing maybe the equivalent of 2 or 3 jobs. So adding more work is definitely a bad outcome. So when we think of the effects of these things, so when we have workspaces that are creating more friction than they're streamlining, we start to get some effects like overwhelm, decreased focus, decision fatigue, and frustration. This, especially again at the team level, manifests in different ways, where a team member might get frustrated and just avoid an area of the workspace or avoid Notion altogether, which then requires us to backtrack and reset. And all in that process, we're losing time and energy and productivity just by way of the effects of a workspace that's not optimized for purpose. And then this is also topical because one big complaint or one big challenge, at least over the past several years, has been just more managerial, more admin, kind of tedious tasks, which we can call the work about work, where we're spending more and more of our time updating information that either could be automated or could be maybe curated out altogether in some cases. So this is usually working with clients. One of the big priorities is getting this work about work as close to zero as possible, just to make sure that every team member within an organization is maximizing the time and the energy that they do have to focus on the work that they have expertise in and not managing their workspace or their team's dashboard. It may be intuitive for us if you're a Notion creator, if you've been making templates, or if you're consulting. And it's easy to take for granted that we've spent maybe hundreds or even thousands of hours building or tweaking our workspaces. But for the overwhelming majority of people, when we're met with that blank canvas in Notion and that forward slash with every possible block type in there, could be overwhelming. And even with the templates that are available from the template gallery, just doing these demo calls, they're still incredibly complicated. And to duplicate a template into a workspace, customize it, and get it up and running, for me as a consultant, sometimes it's a little jarring. Just getting a sense of how does this template work, who is it made for, and how may we modify this to fit our specific goals. Something to keep in mind there. Specifically with new teams, the challenges that have come up more than once are I'm not sure where to get started, that kind of blank canvas starting point. The templates are often very powerful, but could be seen as complicated. So it's really getting the balance between something that's has utility, but is easy to implement. And as I mentioned, for Notion specifically, the onboarding of even where we have that kind of questionnaire, which is what are we using Notion for? It just populates some random databases and hopes that those are solving for what you're trying to do, but is in most cases is not quite sufficient for most teams. Something to keep in mind. But there are still big benefits, and it's still a net positive if we approach our workspaces the right way. Specifically, we can customize this exactly how we want. So we can show or hide any information or database properties that we'd like in a variety of different views. And if we optimize for it, it can really be simple to use and maintain. And lastly, once I think teams and individuals get over the hump of the learning curve, it is still very intuitive when we compare it to other tools that could be a lot harder to get up and running with. And as I mentioned on templates, this has been a real highlight working with teams that are brand new to Notion and shout out if just curious if there's any template makers in here, just if you want to say hi or do a little wave or something in the chat. But if we're making templates either for ourselves or for other users, the overwhelming majority have a lot in there in terms of views, databases, properties, and they may be very powerful, but very often hard to use and hard to implement. And shout out to the templates that do have thorough documentation, because that does go a long way. If you have a template that is doing a lot of work and is very powerful and has the documentation to walk users through step by step, how do we apply this? How can we customize it? What properties are absolutely necessary versus optional to have? That goes a very long way and is super valuable for you and for anybody else who's making templates or thinking about creating and selling templates potentially, not overlooking the documentation side, whether it's a walkthrough video or a step-by-step process in a standard Notion page. Okay, when we think about building a purpose-driven workspace, we're really trying to find the balance between structure and openness. Structure just so that we don't have to manually think or actively think about where we're going in our workspace or how this one particular page is set up versus another page. So consistent structure just removes that mental load of understanding where to go, while also allowing for flexibility in terms of sometimes we just want to open a page and take down notes or throw in a sketch that we made in Miro or Figma and not have to think through too much of the details about where that should live. So whether or not we start with a template, we need a plan. And with every client project, it may seem a little basic, but we solely start with a bullet pointed outline Notion page before we jump into any databases, any dashboards. We could spend weeks on the outline just to get clarity on exactly what we need and making sure that anything that's built is essential to the team and has a clear purpose. And the main kind of scenarios, if we use a template and it's got a bunch of stuff and it turns out we're not needing 80% of what's in there, that's causing friction and causing mental load that could be avoided. When we think about the big benefits of a purpose-driven workspace, we're streamlining work, we're being more productive, we can collaborate more effectively because we're accounting for different archetypes and different users. And teams are just happier because we know what to expect when we open the workspace. We know that there's not going to be any surprises that could cause stress and frustration. And through the increasing suite of tools that many teams use, we're now having to jump around between many different tools and extensions and integrations that are great and are more powerful than ever. But the downside is it's causing that added stress. So one big benefit of Notion is being able to consolidate at least some of the information that could live in a combination of Dropbox, Google Drive, someone's computer, someone's notes in their phone, and consolidating knowledge for whether you're an independent creator or a team. Okay, first step with purpose-driven workspaces organizing. So when we think about organizing, I always go back to this quote because when we take on big projects that feel insurmountable or close to impossible to execute, the best thing we could do is break it down into smaller steps. And even if those small steps are overwhelming, breaking those into smaller steps. So breaking projects down as much as we need to just go one thing at a time and figure out a way to get ourselves to the finish line. And this applies directly to organizing our workspace. So when we think about organizing, there's no way to avoid a quick talk on information architecture. And I'll keep it high level here so that we don't get too into the weeds. But when we think of information architecture specifically related to Notion, and I know we've got a lot of stuff on here that you don't have to read, but a couple of things to highlight is we're really trying to optimize for clarity, consistency, and hierarchy. These are the three things that we tend to go back to when I'm helping a team build a workspace or we're trying to fix or optimize an existing workspace. And tactics like labeling, using breadcrumbs to navigate, leveraging search all go a long way. And this is a tool that I tend to use to communicate how we can start to organize information in Notion. So when we think about the workspace as a whole, we likely consolidate higher level information or database views in dashboards. So we can think of a dashboard as a collection of links, filter database views that are maybe most important or most critical to you or to the team. And then moving our way into databases, pages that live within those, properties of databases, page blocks. So what is the stuff that's in each page? And then these kind of individual pages that might live in the private section of your sidebar, or you might have just quickly jotted down some notes and then shared with a team member that have been in a little no man's land, which is okay. Sometimes we want to optimize for speed, and not everything needs to live in a database. So when we think about the example of projects and tasks, I always recommend for teams that are brand new to Notion, starting with a simple page. And this might just be outlining what are we trying to track in Notion? And for each type of thing that we're tracking, what is that metadata? What are those properties that we absolutely need? And even if we have ideas on how we might add in some new functionality or take advantage of some of Notion's new features, avoiding that to make sure that phase one of a workspace is up and running and is optimized to us or to our teams. So in this case, we're managing projects, tasks, and meetings in Notion, and a handful of properties within that. So from there, when we get into something like project and task management, I'd say the level 2 is organizing stuff about each project in a page using checklists, which you could still tag team members. You could add dates. You can add reminders for dates. So there's a lot you can do in just a simple checklist without even touching databases. And big benefit from this is it allows teams to just get comfortable navigating, going into the right page that we're looking for, updating information, and getting acquainted with using the forward slash to add content, checking a box off, or adding comments to team members, things like that. And then once we maybe hit some limitations with that model, then we start to think of specific benefits that come from organizing this stuff, specifically projects and tasks, into databases, which are primarily the ability to sort a high volume of information or filter to only show specific views. So in this case, we want to change the view quickly from sorting grouping by project to grouping by team member. So as we add that complexity, there is a learning curve to moving from a simple page to a page within a database, but the benefits are definitely there when we think about setting up views that are filtered and that are really customized to a particular part of our workflow. Mostly to highlight the jump from pages to databases, which is a big jump and is a big undertaking, especially for teams. If we already have our workspace databases set up, it's definitely worth considering going back in there, looking at our properties, thinking through, are all of these properties essential to my workflow? Side note, if you delete properties, there's a deleted section, so you can always get them back as an FYI. That's a relatively new update, but really just carving out anything that's not essential to our workspace. When we think about phase 2, we have our structure up and running. We can now move to managing, and this is where we want to make sure that we're not adding extra work for ourselves. And in a lot of ways, the workspace can manage itself. And I always go back to this quote where productivity is never an accident. It's always the product of combination of these 3 things: excellence, intelligent planning, and effort. So we really just want to optimize our space to do these things and to do them well. This is something that has really come to fruition as of late, just talking to lots of new teams and companies, which has really highlighted that there are many different types of Notion users. And probably the biggest challenge, especially at the team level, but also applies to individual creators, is identifying where we fit into one of these archetypes. It's not an exact science. We might be somewhere in the middle between one or another, but it does have an effect on how we tend to default to setting up pages and dashboards in Notion, and can also cause a lot of friction when one person is driving the workspace and is maybe a hyper minimalist and wants no additional properties or data for pages, defaults to list view for every database view, whereas a captain or a C-level team member comes in and wants to see more data, like at a high level, just to open a dashboard and see everything in one place. And this is something that I'm working on a resource to really break these down and turn into a poll to see where we land, and also using that with bigger teams that I'm working with to get a sense of where we land, and also as an opportunity to educate ourselves on how this affects how we set up our workspaces. So something to keep in mind there when we're thinking about how we're laying out our workspaces. And then another area that I want to highlight is, this is more coming from user interface design, but I think also applies pretty well to Notion workspaces, is what's called progressive disclosure, which is essentially limiting information in stages so that we don't show or present too much information at once, really just to avoid that overwhelm and make sure that we could have a system for drilling deeper into a particular page, or maybe toggles within a page. So when we think about this, we're starting at the dashboard level. So if we have a home HQ type page, and then we organize types of pages in databases, we have those pages here. We will likely want to highlight or always show specific properties that are most important. So if we're thinking about projects, maybe the start and end date, the status, and then team members that are involved. Whereas even if we have more properties, just hiding those by default so that we could prioritize a small number of properties. And then lastly, page blocks, which really include the bulk of the content, where we could group larger pages by toggles or by headings, leveraging the table of contents feature to jump through specific sections. So one common issue that I find for teams that are already in Notion and we're kind of working on optimizing is usually there's way too much stuff in the dashboard and way too much detail. So we're bringing in information that should be in a page block in our home HQ dashboard. It could seem like it's more convenient or efficient to just drop all the stuff into the dashboard, but it's usually thinking through, okay, how do we link to specific pieces of information so that we could jump straight into that section? And in some cases, jump straight from a dashboard to a specific page block if it's a very important block. But as much as possible, trying to keep this overarching system for how we're controlling information, if that makes sense. And then when we think about moving from a home page to a dashboard, to a project, to a task, one thing that also goes a long way is just consistent layouts. So in this case, in this particular project, we're using this left-hand column for linking to specific project database views, and then allowing us to jump back into active projects or upcoming or archive, and know that if we see that 2-column view, we're in a dashboard view. Whereas if we open up a project page, we get that pop-up view. It's a behavior that's consistent where the HQ is that one page, and then every dashboard is structured in that 2-column layout, and then every database page is structured just vertically, no multiple columns, and just properties and the body of the page. And then the last step of building a purpose-driven workspace is streamlining. Another thing that happens quite a bit is teams jump straight into automations or integrating all their tools together directly in Notion or via third-party tools without having the structure already in place, which ends up causing more work to then backtrack and pause those initiatives. So rather than jumping into the automations, which seem like they are saving time and decreasing the amount of manual tasks, if we don't have the structure in place, it may cause other problems. The most common one being we're sending updates to Slack and it's completely unfiltered. And then all of a sudden our Slack gets bombarded with tons of updates that then make the channel unusable. And when we're thinking about streamlining and specifically thinking through automations, the more we can default to simplicity, the better, for a couple of reasons. Number one, even though I'm personally comfortable setting up automations to an extent, more often than not, teams are not going to have a Notion consultant on call permanently. So teams do need to be able to maintain automations, which is why we need to optimize for simplicity. And then if you're thinking about your own workspace, the more automations we set up, the more we do need to track them, and when there's errors, be able to go back in and understand which automation is this related to. So it needs to have a clear benefit that is outweighing the time and energy that goes into maintaining that automation. So when we think about streamlining, a couple of things that can work well, whether it's maybe monthly or quarterly, auditing your workspace, thinking through what do we no longer need? What did I test out and experiment with that just turned out to not really work or be useful? Removing that stuff from the workspace as much as possible. As we mentioned in that previous video walkthrough, if you always put quick links or your table of contents on the right-hand side of the page, do that for every second level dashboard so that you don't have to think about the layout for every particular dashboard. Database templates and buttons. So once we have the foundational stuff, this is really about saving time. Any recurring tasks or sets of tasks that are consistent could probably be automated within Notion, just via buttons or via database templates. So when we think about auditing, these are the main zones of auditing, but really just identifying, is there an area of your workspace that you haven't quite kept up with or reviewed in a while? That's probably a good opportunity to see how you can clean up those areas. As an aside, Notion AI has gotten a lot better in the past few months. One thing I've noticed is the workspaces where we have less pages and less stuff, Notion AI works a lot more effectively. So it's almost like, how can we remove as much as possible if we are using Notion AI to maybe surface the right information or see information about a previous project? It definitely works a lot better when we have less stuff in our workspace. Something to consider if we are micromanaging and creating a lot of tasks and subtasks. Unless we're labeling them differently, it could cause some friction. And then specifically with auditing, some things to take a look at is, for example, when we are looking at task management, for example, do we have tasks in there that are no longer relevant or we actually completed, just so that they are not visible in scenarios where you see what are my outstanding tasks. And more broadly, things like information architecture, where you're zooming out and saying, is this easy to navigate? Am I spending too much time jumping between different pages? In which case, how can we clean that up? And I'll make sure that send the slides over to everybody at the very end in case we want to deep dive. When we think about consistent layouts, in this case, going back to that previous example, each of these secondary dashboards have the same 2-column layout, where on the right, we're seeing specific filtered views. We're just making it as easy as possible. How do we just use very clear pages as a way to navigate to get to the right place? And as I mentioned, when we get into pre-populating tasks, but when we create, say, a project template, adding in a button that it basically says, when I click this button, add these pages to my task database, where they're connected to the current project. And maybe if we know which team member is assigned to that task, we can do that automatically. This could also go a long way for those repetitive projects, maybe whether it's content related or marketing related. That's probably the most common use cases. As an FYI, you have a max of 100 steps within a button. So you can get very specific with how we set up buttons. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll demo this here and just to see how this works, and won't go through the whole thing because you could definitely do it independently. And let me just do my demo version. What this is doing in a nutshell is guiding us through specific questions around clarifying our workspace purpose, and then using custom AI blocks to map out a workspace outline and then diagramming that outline out. It may not account for everything. And if you have existing databases in your workspace, it'll mostly be useful to compare the outline versus what you currently have as a way to think through ways to curate your current workspace. But in this case, if we add our answers to these questions, what is the primary purpose? What are the top 2 to 3 goals? Is your workspace currently meeting these goals? And the more context we have here, the better to help AI answer those questions. So when we add our answers here, there's an AI assistant, which has a script already set up, which is down here, just saying, hey, just refer to the clarifying your workspace, so that when we generate, it'll take what I answered and then give us a 1.0 outline of what should be in the workspace, followed by a summary tackling these questions, like, how does this help me move toward my goals? And how does this address my challenges? And side note, I'm also curious because it worked pretty well for me personally, but to see if it's useful for all of us. So when we do that, if we say copy and paste this into the section below, I'm going to copy this here and then drop it into this section. Maybe we make some changes here, like for clients, I might want where they came from and also region, if they're in the US or EU or elsewhere, and then review, make some changes here on our outline. And then in this last section, this prompt is taking our outline from above and then creating what's called a mermaid diagram. Basically allows us to create diagrams, which is pretty cool. So when we create that, what it'll do is take our outline and then make 2 diagrams. Number one is the dashboard, what it would encompass within that dashboard view. In this case, it's saying show the client dashboard, proposal tracker, and tasks as 3 key sections. And then the next diagram is showing what the relations are between these different databases. This is sometimes a little hit or miss. And I think the more databases we have, the more wonky it could get. So it's definitely worth playing around with. But for more kind of simplified workflows, this has been really helpful just to visualize what are we making and how are these things connected, to really just also see if there's any changes that we want to make before we start actually building. So here we could just update the view to the preview so that we just see that diagram. And then we can drop this down here. Let's do the same thing for this section. Oh, grab the whole thing rather. And then from here, we can move these diagrams into another page and have them referenced in case we're building. And when we do build a 1.0 workspace, we kind of default to this and refer to this to get feedback in terms of, hey, if we have some questions or concerns about the workspace, let's go back to our diagram to see where we might want to make some changes. And if we do need to approach the structure of the workspace differently, I would encourage you to play around with the prompt if you do have, and I know there's some limitations for AI blocks if we don't have AI turned on in the workspace, but I would definitely encourage you, if you do, to expand on the prompt to see if there's any specific things that you definitely want to tackle in your workspace. Just explore how it works. And I think these types of exercises are really just good to cross-check with our own ideas and to highlight if there's anything that's going in the wrong direction. You'll be able to see it in visual form in that diagram to hopefully help steer you in the right direction. That is the guide. And then also everybody here, I'll follow up when that full playbook is available, what's in there, and if it's worth checking out. I'll just leave this up. If you do want to get notified when the playbook becomes available, I want to make sure if we have any questions, have some time for those. Yeah, we can drop them in the chat. Sonia says, how do you reconcile different versions of workspaces if you need to make major changes? Great question. I prefer migrating, where it really just gives us an opportunity to not migrate old or outdated data. It is a little tedious. There are ways to do it where we can keep relations. I'll see if I can find a resource that I used for my manifest template that was specifically on how to migrate while keeping relations. But yeah, it could be a little tedious. Yeah, I definitely hear you on that being a cause of messy workspaces. Bill says, do you have any suggestions for managing a sandbox to make updates? And yeah, great question. So number one, setting up, if you do have access to team spaces, an entirely different team space that is, if you are working with a team or not, making sure that's private so that we just have that as a sandbox and team members don't get confused. But also from there, using that to think through properties that are needed. And also if you have a project that's starting that you can use that new sandbox for, or if you have new documents that you're managing or organizing, you can use them in the sandbox just to get as real of a use as possible and more realistic once there's real stuff in there. And then if you're feeling like it's replacing your previous workspace, making a decision on whether you want to optimize or clean up the existing workspace. If you have a lot of content in there, that could be easier. But if you have an existing workspace that doesn't have a lot of stuff in it, but you have a system that you're really excited about, then you can probably make more sense to migrate to that new space. Cool. Hope that was helpful. And again, I'll follow up with everybody with the recording, the link to the template if we missed it, and when the Workcraft playbook launches. I'll keep everybody posted on that. But otherwise, super curious if there's any areas that you feel like we should have covered a little bit more, or things that you were expecting that we didn't cover. Would absolutely love your feedback. If you have it, I'd love to hear it. So feel free to email me or to reach out. Hope it was helpful, and hopefully see you in the next webinar. Have a good one, everybody.